Welcome to Something About Sleep. We hope you'll let our stories guide you to a nice, peaceful slumber as you learn about history and what it was like to be a human in times long since past. Now, I need to get to sleep, and if you're watching this video, chances are you do too. So, without further ado, take it away.
Thank you, sir. On tonight's episode, we will explore Isaac Newton's secret alchemical workshop. So join me here by the fire and rest your weary eyes as I tell you a tale from long, long ago. There is a quieter side of Isaac Newton's life that is easy to miss. Most of us first meet him beneath an apple tree, watching the sky, or holding a prism toward a beam of light. We picture the great book of motion and gravity, the careful diagrams, and the mathematical laws that would change the study of nature. But behind the familiar portrait is another room, warmer and dimmer than the study, where a fire was kept alive for long stretches of the night. Near the garden at Trinity College, Cambridge, Newton maintained a small working space filled with crucibles, glass vessels, brick furnaces, soot, ash, and handwritten notes. Here, during certain seasons, he turned his attention toward a subject that the 17th century knew as chymistry. The spelling may look slightly unfamiliar. Chymistry with a Y is a useful historical word because it belongs to Newton's own age. It covered a wide landscape of practical crafts and ambitious questions, the making of pigments, mineral acids, medicines, distilled substances, metal preparations, and, for some practitioners, the hoped-for transformation of one metal into another. It cannot be divided neatly into modern chemistry on one side and old alchemy on the other. Newton entered that landscape seriously. His surviving chemical writings, copied texts, indexes, and notes amount to an immense body of material, assembled over many years and mostly left unpublished in his lifetime. Tonight, we are not going to treat this workshop as a chamber of dark magic, nor will we pretend that one hidden experiment explains every famous achievement of Newton's life. The room was probably more modest than later imaginations would like it to be. Its mysteries are quieter. A fire that scarcely went out for weeks, a garden path crossed after dusk, a book opened beside a cooling vessel, and a scholar returning to the same difficult questions without ever leaving us a simple final answer. So, before we step inside, take a moment to settle in wherever you are. Let the colder air of the garden gather around the stone walls. Let the distant college sounds fade into the background. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing where you are listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. If these gentle journeys through history help you rest, you can also like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment with a topic you would enjoy hearing about another night. Now the path turns toward a smaller light near the garden. The glow does not flare or flicker wildly. It is steady, contained, and patient. Beyond the doorway, the bricks hold a little warmth. A few pieces of glass catch the firelight. Somewhere nearby, a page waits for another line of compact handwriting. And with the night deepening over Cambridge, we can quietly enter Newton's laboratory. To understand why this room belonged naturally to Isaac Newton's world, it helps to set aside the tidy compartments that shape the way his life is often remembered. The Newton of schoolbooks appears in a sequence of clear images. There is the young man at Woolsthorpe, thinking about the falling apple and the force that draws objects toward the earth. There is the experimenter with sunlight and a prism, observing a band of colours emerge from what had appeared to be simple white light. There is the maker of a reflecting telescope turning mirrors toward the sky. And later there is the author of the Principia, the great mathematical work published in 1687, setting out laws of motion and an account of universal gravitation. Those images are real parts of his story, even when popular retellings simplify them, but they are not the entire story. Newton's papers preserve other kinds of labour. Long copied passages from older authors, lists of chemical substances, pages of comparisons, experiments recorded in a compressed hand, and manuscripts that circle repeatedly around change, generation, metals, and the hidden operations of nature. Some of these writings remain difficult even for specialists to interpret. Some are clearly transcriptions from other sources rather than statements of Newton's own conclusions. Others show him comparing texts and observations with an intensity that makes it impossible to dismiss the subject as a casual diversion. The scale is striking. Modern scholars working with Newton's archive have estimated that roughly 1 million words of his surviving writing and transcription concern alchemical or chemical subjects. The surviving material includes notebooks, experimental reports, indexes, excerpts, treatises, and fragments in both English and Latin. Stretches across decades. Some pieces are orderly, some provisional, some stained by use or crowded with additions. Together they show a patient, sustained inquiry rather than a single late-night curiosity. The chronology is not perfectly simple, but the manuscripts allow us to follow the interest across a large portion of Newton's adult life. Some notes reach back toward the late 1660s, close to the years when he was becoming established at Trinity. Other writings belong to the 1670s, the 1680s, and the 1690s. A major notebook containing chemical notes and experimental reports ranges across decades. The Index Chemicus appears to have grown through the 1680s. Other manuscripts gather later reflections, questions, extracts, or incomplete treatments of operations associated with transformation. This spread of dates matters because it protects the story from another easy simplification. Newton did not pass through one brief alchemical phase and then set it aside forever, nor did he spend every year doing exactly the same thing. Interests deepen, narrow, return, and change shape. A writer may spend one period copying older sources, another period testing materials, and another arranging the vocabulary accumulated earlier. A subject can remain present even when it is not the dominant work of a particular month. The titles listed in modern catalogues offer glimpses rather than complete explanations. There are observations of matter in glass. There are notes on philosophical mercury. There are extracts from older chemical authorities. There are questions concerning the philosopher's stone. There are experimental reports, lists of writers, and unfinished discussions of the growth of metals and minerals. Some texts preserve Newton's direct labour more clearly than others. Some are copies or compilations, some contain additions that show later return. Each document belongs to the archive without carrying the same evidentiary weight. The difference between a transcript and a conclusion is especially important. Newton copied widely because copying was a tool of study. A copied passage might represent interest, doubt, preservation, or comparison. It might be tested against another author or against an experiment. It might remain useful as a vocabulary even if its broader theory did not persuade him. The presence of a text in Newton's hand tells us that he engaged with it. It does not always tell us where he finally stood. This creates a more realistic portrait of learning. The workshop does not contain a secret book Newton followed from beginning to end. It contains a library of partial guides, competing authorities, puzzling phrases, and observations that may not fit neatly together. Newton's task was partly selective. He had to decide which passages deserved return, which terms concealed a real process, and which promises dissolved under attention. Several writers formed part of that difficult conversation across time. George Ripley, an English alchemical author associated with the 15th century, remained influential through later copies, commentaries, and printed editions. Elias Ashmole's 17th-century anthology brought English alchemical verse together for new readers. George Starkey, writing partly under the name Irenaeus Philippius, supplied texts whose language and practical claims received close attention in Newton's circle of reading. Jan Baptist van Helmont offered a vocabulary of active processes, medicines, and matter that influenced early modern chemical discussion. Robert Boyle represented a more immediate experimental world, connected not only through print but through correspondence and personal networks. These names should not turn into a lecture list. They are more useful as quiet presences on the shelf. One volume is opened for a particular phrase. Another is consulted because a later writer interpreted the first. A copied extract rests beside a page of notes. The authors do not speak with one voice. Their disagreements are part of the work. The variety of sources also explains why Newton's own vocabulary can feel layered. A planetary name may sit beside a practical observation. A Latin phrase may be followed by an English comment. A symbolic image may lead to a reference in the Index Chemicus. The page records a mind moving between languages and traditions, looking for order without assuming that order has already been found. In this sense, the hidden workshop begins before Newton reaches the furnace. It begins when he decides that an old text is worth another reading. It continues when he compares a phrase against a result. It extends through the act of indexing, because an index is a promise to return. The fire may be the room's quiet clock, but paper is its memory. Newton arrived at Trinity College in 1661. He became a Fellow of the College in 1667 and was appointed Lucasian Professor of Mathematics in 1669. Still a young man. Cambridge was the setting for much of the work that established his public reputation, but it was also the setting for the quieter chemical studies that remained largely outside that public image. His rooms, books, notebooks, telescope, garden, and a laboratory formed parts of one working life. A question raised in one place could travel into another. A page copied upstairs might be carried toward the furnace. An observation made beside a vessel might return later as a note in a crowded manuscript. It is tempting from a modern distance to imagine Newton as divided into separate selves, the rational mathematician by day and the secret alchemist by night. That picture is memorable, but it is misleading. Newton did not live inside the categories of a modern textbook. In the 17th century, many learned people were asking how matter changed, how medicines worked, how minerals formed, how light behaved, and whether the visible world might be governed by active principles not immediately apparent to the senses. The boundaries among natural philosophy, practical experiment medicine, craft knowledge, and alchemical tradition were not fixed in the way they later became. This does not mean that every part of Newton's chemistry should be translated into modern science or treated as an early version of a later discipline. It also does not mean that his work in the laboratory produced a hidden key to the Principia. Historians continue to debate how particular threads in Newton's thought may have overlapped, and caution is important. But the private workshop should not be sealed away as though it belonged to another person entirely. The same Newton who questioned the nature of light and motion also paid close attention to metals in a crucible, to old texts with symbolic language, and to the possibility that nature concealed processes beneath its visible surfaces. There is something slightly lonely about the picture, although it does not need to be sad. Newton was capable of long concentration. He could work late, forget a meal, and retreat from ordinary conversation into an inner landscape of questions. His assistant Humphrey Newton, who was not related to him, later remembered the intensity of those habits. Humphrey's recollections were written later in life, and they should be treated with the care due to memory rather than as a minute-by-minute record. Yet they bring the Cambridge years close enough for us to hear the quiet rhythm of the place. Humphrey remembered Newton's garden, the telescope placed near the stairs, the laboratory near the east end of the chapel, the crucibles used in the work with metals, and the fires kept alive for long periods in spring and autumn. He remembered copying the Principia before publication. He remembered rare visitors, occasional walks, late hours, and meals that sometimes went nearly untouched. There is no need to turn these details into a legend. Their power comes from their ordinariness. A scholar can be famous in one century and still appear in another person's memory as a man standing at a desk because an idea arrived too quickly for him to pull out a chair. So the workshop is not a hidden second life. It is a narrow doorway into the broader life of a 17th-century thinker. Through that doorway we can glimpse a world where knowledge was made from both books and hands, where a vessel might sit beside a manuscript, where a furnace could become a quiet clock, and where uncertainty was not a failure but the natural condition of difficult inquiry. Before moving closer to the fire, let us step back outside for a moment and look at the setting more carefully. The college environment mattered because Newton's workshop did not stand in an empty landscape. It belonged to a university town still shaped by older rhythms of learning. Books were copied by hand as well as purchased in print. Letters carried arguments and observations between scholars who might wait days or weeks for an answer. News travelled through conversation, parcels and visits. A professor's room could serve as study, meeting place, library and retreat. An outbuilding near a garden could serve as a laboratory without needing the polished appearance of a later scientific institution. The word laboratory itself can make the mind jump too quickly toward a modern room. Bright surfaces, standardized glassware, cabinets with labels, and procedures written for a group of trained workers. Newton's laboratory belonged to another material world. Apparatus was less uniform. Vessels could be acquired, adapted, sealed, repaired, and used repeatedly. Furnaces were built for particular purposes and altered when the work required it. Knowledge rested partly in the hand, in the eye, and in habits learned through practice. Supplies also had ordinary histories before they entered the room. Fuel had to be carried, bricks had to be arranged, glass had to be made, purchased, or replaced. Metals and mineral substances came through networks of trade and craft. Paper, ink, quills, string, sealing material, and candles were part of the same economy of attention. The elaborate intellectual questions rested on common objects that someone had transported, sold, stored, and maintained. This grounding is important because it keeps the workshop human in scale. Newton's fame can make every object near him seem like a relic. In its own time, much of the room would have looked like equipment at work. A receiver was useful because it received. A crucible was valuable because it endured heat. A brick furnace mattered because it held and directed fire. The mystery lay not in ornament, but in what the materials might reveal after enough patience. Cambridge itself offered contrasts. The college hall gathered people for meals. The chapel ordered parts of the day. The courts made social life visible. The library gathered books into a shared institution. Yet study also depended on withdrawal. A difficult problem often required a room where the common flow of the college could become distant. Newton's path toward the garden led into that quieter zone. His official role as Lucasian Professor of Mathematics belonged to the public structure of the university. He lectured, wrote, corresponded, and participated in college life, even if his audiences were sometimes small. His chemistry belonged more closely to private time. The two roles existed side by side. A professor could pass through the court as others did, then turn toward a furnace that few people understood. The 17th century also made darkness more present than it is for many people now. Evening did not disappear at the press of a switch. Candlelight was local. Firelight was uneven. A person moving from a court toward a garden after sunset crossed real shadow. This made the laboratory glow more noticeable without making it theatrical. It was simply one small inhabited point within a darker college landscape. That point of light invites a slower kind of historical imagination. We do not need to know which shelf stood nearest the door or exactly how many steps led from Newton's rooms to the garden. We need only keep the scale plausible. A professor's rooms, a stair, a telescope, a cultivated garden, a practical laboratory, and the ordinary labour required to maintain it. From there, the scene can breathe. Cambridge at the end of the day would not fall silent all at once. Footsteps might still cross a court. A door could close somewhere along a stair. Voices might briefly pass beneath an archway and then fade. The college bell, depending on the hour, would mark time in the distance. Stone walls, warmed faintly by daylight, would begin to surrender their heat as evening gathered over the roofs. Trinity College had its formal spaces, its rooms, hall, chapel, passages, courts, and gardens. Newton's daily life moved among them. Humphrey's later account places the laboratory at the left end of the garden, near the east end of the chapel. The exact appearance of the structure cannot be reconstructed with complete confidence, and it is better not to imagine an elaborate laboratory built for spectacle. It was a practical working place, may have seemed more like a modest outbuilding or shed-like room than the bright institutional laboratories familiar today. The approach itself helped set the pace. From the college rooms, a person could move toward the garden, down steps, away from the busier flow of the court. Humphrey remembered Newton's telescope at the head of the stairs going down into the garden, pointed eastward. The telescope and the laboratory belonged to the same small landscape. A stair, a garden, an instrument turned toward the sky, and a workshop concerned with matter close at hand. One line of attention extended outward toward comets and planets. Another moved inward toward the behavior of substances in heat. In both directions, the world resisted a quick glance. The garden offered a softer contrast to the brick and soot of the laboratory. Humphrey remembered it as well kept and rarely out of order. He described Newton occasionally taking a short walk there and disliking the sight of a weed. A gardener did much of the actual work. Newton was not presented as a patient horticultural labourer pruning branches and turning earth each morning. Instead, the garden became a place of brief movement between periods of intense study. A turn along the path, a pause, and then perhaps a rapid return upstairs when a thought demanded to be written down. We should be careful with the picturesque details. No surviving account tells us the precise colour of the evening sky on any particular night, the exact sound of shoes on the path, or the smell that drifted from the workshop door. Those are parts of an imagined visit rather than documented facts. But imagination can remain modest. The garden would have cooled after sunset. A maintained fire would have warmed the brick around it. Coal, ash, metal, glass and paper would have shaped the room's practical atmosphere. A candle might add a smaller point of light when the furnace glow was not enough for reading. The college around Newton was not empty. Students, fellows, servants, gardeners, visitors and tradespeople belonged to its ordinary life. Yet the laboratory could still feel separate after dusk. The main rhythm of the day had slowed. The garden path led away from meals and conversation. The room required attention of a different kind. A fire could not be hurried. A vessel could not be persuaded to reveal its change more quickly, merely because the night was growing late. Humphrey's account gives us a few unusually tangible details. He remembered a laboratory furnished with chemical materials, bodies, receivers, heads, crucibles, and other equipment. He singled out the crucibles because Newton used them in fusing metals. He also remembered that Newton would sometimes build or alter brick furnaces himself when necessary. The room, then, was not simply a symbolic setting for intellectual speculation. It was a working environment shaped by heat, materials, and repeated use. Imagine standing near the threshold without touching anything. The floor is practical rather than polished. Some surfaces have darkened over time. A vessel catches the light in a curved reflection. A crucible, heavy and unadorned, waits where it has been set down. The brickwork holds the accumulated evidence of heat. The garden beyond the door feels cooler by comparison, and the college buildings seem a little farther away than they did a few minutes earlier. There is no grand unveiling. The room does not offer a single object that explains Newton's purpose. Instead, it reveals a collection of tasks. Something must be checked. Something must be allowed to cool. A note must be compared with an earlier passage. Fuel must be tended. An observation must be written before it is forgotten. The workshop is immersive not because it contains theatrical secrets, but because it rewards a slower attention. Outside, the ordered garden suggests patience of another kind. Paths are maintained, weeds are removed, seasons return. The laboratory follows its own seasonal pattern as well, with periods of concentrated work in spring and autumn. When the fire is active, the room acquires a time of its own. Daylight enters and withdraws. The air outside changes. Bells mark hours. The coals continue their low work. This is the physical centre of tonight's story. We will return to the garden path many times. We will move upstairs toward books and notes, outward toward letters and visitors, and forward into the later history of Newton's scattered papers. But the laboratory remains close. Even when we step away from it, there will be a sense of warmth behind us, modest light near the chapel, and a patient fire asking to be watched. Before we examine the vessels more closely, however, we should pause at the edge of the room and ask a simple question. What did chemistry mean to the people who practiced it? The answer will make the workshop less surprising, and it will allow Newton's experiments to appear in the world that gave them shape. The word chemistry carried a wider meaning in the 17th century than the word chemistry usually carries today. It belonged to a world of workshops, apothecaries, mines, kitchens, distilleries, gardens, furnaces, books, and private cabinets of experiment. Some of its practitioners were learned physicians or natural philosophers. Others were artisans who knew substances through repeated labour. Some hoped to prepare useful medicines. Some made colours for cloth or paint. Some worked with glass, metal, salts, mineral waters, or distilled liquids. Some pursued the old promise of chrysopoeia, the transformation of less precious metals into gold. The categories overlapped. A person who studied a mineral preparation for medical use might also pay attention to its colours under heat. A person who distilled a liquid for a practical purpose might ask broader questions about separation and purity. A writer who described the generation of minerals underground might move easily between observations, analogies, inherited traditions, and speculation. The modern habit of sorting every activity into either respectable science or discredited alchemy can make this landscape look simpler than it was. That does not mean every chemical claim was sound, or that all practitioners followed the same standards. 17th century chemistry contained real craft knowledge, hopeful theories, closely guarded techniques, elaborate metaphors, unsuccessful experiments, commercial promises, medical debates, and arguments about nature's deepest structure. A single book might contain useful observations beside claims that later generations would reject. A single reader might copy a passage in order to test it, compare it, question it, or place it beside another passage that seemed to disagree. Newton entered this world at a time when experimentation was becoming increasingly important to the study of nature, but older traditions still carried weight. The printed page and the workshop bench supported one another. Books offered recipes, terms, images, and reported results. The laboratory tested what could be observed. A failed trial did not necessarily end the inquiry. It might produce another note, another comparison, or another search through the literature. The term alchemy often brings to mind a single goal, making gold. That goal mattered, and it should not be minimized. The Greek-derived word chrysopoeia referred to gold making, and it remained a serious possibility to some 17th century chemists. Yet it was only one part of the larger field. Chemists also laid claim to technologies involving pigments, dyes, mineral acids, distilled substances, and medicines. Their work could be practical and commercial as well as philosophical. It could take place in a shop, a court, a household, or a college garden. Medicine was especially important. The early modern period saw vigorous debate over the value of mineral-based remedies and laboratory techniques in preparing medicines. Distillation and sublimation, in which substances were separated or transformed through heat, belonged not only to the dream of transmutation, but also to the changing world of medical practice. We do not need to follow those debates into technical detail tonight. It is enough to notice that a furnace and a glass vessel could be connected to many purposes, from the useful to the speculative. The language of chemistry could also be difficult by design. Writers used allegory, symbolic names, abbreviated phrases, and images that concealed as much as they revealed. A term such as the green lion might not point to one simple substance in every context. Philosophical mercury was not merely the familiar silvery metal found in ordinary descriptions. Diana's doves, the caducean rod of mercury, and other vivid expressions belong to a vocabulary built from craft tradition, classical reference, religious suggestion, and intentional concealment. The words ask the reader to interpret rather than merely follow. This guarded style had several possible purposes. Some knowledge was treated as valuable property. A practitioner might not wish to hand a profitable method to every reader. Some writers believed that deeper knowledge should be reserved for those who had proved their patience and judgment. Symbolic language could also reflect the difficulty of describing transformations that seem to resist ordinary words. And sometimes an obscure expression simply accumulated through copying, translation, and commentary until its meaning became hard to separate from the history of the text itself. For a reader like Newton, the challenge must have been considerable. He did not encounter one orderly handbook with clear definitions and a final chapter of settled conclusions. He encountered a layered archive, old authorities, recent writers, manuscript copies, printed anthologies, English verse, Latin prose, symbols, recipes, indexes, and marginal notes. He had to compare authors who did not always use the same terms in the same way. He had to decide whether a phrase described a material, an operation, an analogy, or several things at once. There is a quiet pleasure in imagining that labour without pretending it was easy. The fire continues to glow while a page is turned. A word appears in one source, and then again in another, altered slightly by context. Newton marks a passage, copies a line, or leaves a note for later. The physical experiment waits while the paper experiment proceeds. A workshop can extend into a library because the same question moves between vessel and book. Newton was not alone in taking chemistry seriously. Robert Boyle, one of the best-known experimental philosophers of the 17th century, wrote about chemical subjects and participated in discussions that crossed the boundaries we use today. Physicians, apothecaries, metallurgists, artisans, and natural philosophers all contributed to the field's varied life. The existence of error or secrecy did not make the entire domain foolish to a contemporary observer. Metals really did alter in colour and form under different conditions. Minerals appeared to grow within the earth. Medicines could be prepared through unfamiliar processes. Glassware and furnaces made invisible changes visible, at least in part. The early modern imagination often understood nature as active. Matter was not always pictured as a collection of inert pieces waiting passively to be moved. Generation, fermentation, ripening, corruption, growth, and decay offered models for thinking about change. Plants emerged from seeds. Metals and minerals seemed to develop underground over long spans of time. A chemist might ask whether art could assist, accelerate, imitate, or reveal processes that nature performed more slowly. This way of thinking could encourage ambitious hopes. If a less perfect metal had not yet reached a more perfect condition, perhaps it could be guided toward it. If a substance held concealed powers, perhaps careful separation could release them. If ordinary appearances hid deeper structures, perhaps a patient observer could learn to read the signs. We should not place modern answers into Newton's mind, but we can understand why the workshop invited questions that felt neither trivial nor absurd within his world. There was also a moral and intellectual atmosphere around certain chemical traditions. Some texts spoke as though nature's deeper knowledge required humility, discipline, and discernment. The reader was expected to separate true guidance from confusion, just as the chemist sought to separate one material from another. This language could encourage secrecy and make the subject feel like a long apprenticeship. The path was not meant to be quick. For a sleep history journey, that slowness is useful. Nothing in this room needs to rush. We can let the 17th century vocabulary settle gradually. An alembic was a vessel associated with distillation, often with a head that guided vapour toward another container. A receiver collected what passed from one part of an apparatus to another. A crucible was a heat-resistant vessel used for substances exposed to high temperatures. An athanor was a furnace associated with maintaining a steady heat over time. Not every piece of apparatus named in the wider chemical world can be proven to have stood inside Newton's own laboratory, but these terms help us understand what a contemporary reader might recognise. The key is modesty. Newton's workshop was not an enchanted stage. It was part of a real intellectual and material culture. A few old terms can help us move through that culture without turning the narration into a manual. Distillation was a way of separating and collecting substances through heat and cooling. An alembic was a head used in distillation, shaped to guide condensed vapour onwards toward a receiver. A receiver was the vessel waiting at the other end. Sublimation described a transformation in which a material rose and collected in a different place, sometimes creating delicate deposits that chemists called flowers. Calcination referred broadly to the heating of a substance until it left a changed, often more powdery remainder. A caput mortuum, literally a dead head, was the non-volatile residue left behind after a distillation. The language is vivid because it grew in workshops rather than only in abstract treatises. Flowers, heads, bodies, spirits, and dead remain gave ordinary names to appearances encountered near heat. A vessel had a body because it held the main material. A head sat above it. A spirit was something volatile enough to rise or travel. A residue seemed dead because the more mobile part had departed. Such terms carried practical meaning, even when later writers also layered them with philosophy or allegory. An athanor was a furnace associated with steady heat. The word is useful not because we can prove that every furnace in Newton's laboratory took one standard form, but because it reminds us that constancy mattered. Certain work depended less on an intense blaze than on a fire that could be trusted not to vanish during the night. The person keeping watch became part of the apparatus in the broadest sense. Human attention maintained the conditions under which matter changed. Some operations were associated with colour. Materials darkened, brightened, crusted, softened, collected, or settled. Chemists named residues, vapours, oils, salts, and metallic preparations according to appearance and inherited convention. The same word could become unstable as it passed from writer to writer. A modern reader seeking a one-to-one glossary can quickly become frustrated. The old vocabulary often behaves more like a family of clues than a list of fixed labels. The vocabulary also reminds us why safety matters. Historical workshops exposed practitioners to substances and fumes that would now demand strict controls. Newton's world did not possess modern standards for ventilation, protective equipment, labelling, or toxic exposure. The calm tone of a night watch should never be mistaken for harmlessness. The safest way to enter the laboratory now is through description, leaving the hazardous details with historians of science rather than attempting to repeat them. There is still plenty to notice from a respectful distance. A cucurbit, a flask with a rounded body, might be joined to a head in a distillation setup. A receiver might catch a liquid slowly. A crucible might emerge from higher heat carrying a fused metal. A brick furnace might be rebuilt because the flow of warmth was not right for the work. Lute, a clay-like sealing material, could protect a joint. None of these objects needs to become an instruction. Together they create a vocabulary of patient making. Practical chemistry moved between commerce and inquiry. Pigments coloured cloth and painted surfaces. Distilled substances entered medicine and household use. Metalworkers already knew that ores, slags, and alloys could behave in surprising ways. Apothecaries worked with plants and minerals. Glassmakers understood fire through long practice. The learned chemist entered a world where artisans possessed valuable knowledge, even when that knowledge was not expressed in the language of university philosophy. Newton's laboratory sits at this meeting point. Books bring old claims and symbolic names. Apparatus brings the resistance of real matter. Craft knowledge brings habits of handling and attention. Natural philosophy brings larger questions about causes. The room does not belong entirely to any one category. That is why the historical term chemistry is so useful. It keeps the field open long enough for us to see it in its own shape. Its fire was useful because heat changed things. Its vessels mattered because separation, collection, and observation mattered. Its books mattered because generations of writers had left a difficult inheritance. Its secrecy mattered because knowledge travelled unevenly, often through selective reading, trusted correspondence, and private notes. Now, with that wider landscape in view, the objects in the laboratory become easier to see. The crucible is no longer merely a dark cup beside the fire. It belongs to a history of metalworking, experimentation, and speculation. The curved glass is no longer decorative. It belongs to the practical work of observing substances as they alter, collect, cool, or separate. The brick furnace is not simply part of the scenery, it is the steady heart of the room. So let us move a little closer, still without disturbing the work. The door remains behind us. The garden air is cooler there. Ahead, firelight falls across brick, glass, metal, ash, and paper. The workshop begins to resolve itself not as a mystery chamber, but as a place built for waiting. A 17th-century laboratory was shaped by heat. Even when no flame was visible from the doorway, the room would carry the signs of it: warmed brick, ash, soot, darkened surfaces, a trace of smoke, and the careful arrangement of vessels meant to withstand or direct a changing temperature. Fire could be lively, but much of its work depended on control. Too little heat might leave a process incomplete. Too much could spoil a vessel or erase the very change an observer hoped to notice. The work demanded restraint. Humphrey Newton's recollections are especially valuable here. He remembered the laboratory as well, supplied with chemical materials and named bodies, receivers, heads, crucibles, and other objects. The language can feel old because it belongs to the workshop vocabulary of his time. A body was the main vessel in an apparatus. A head could sit above it and help direct what rose through heat. A receiver collected material passing onward. A crucible endured the more intense work of the furnace, including the fusing of metals that Humphrey specifically remembered. The inventory should not be over-decorated. Glass vessels may catch a warm reflection, but they are tools. Crucibles are not ornate relics. They are practical containers, stained and used. Brickwork matters because Newton reportedly built and altered furnaces himself when required. That detail brings him closer. The Lucasian professor of mathematics was not only reading and writing. At times he was shaping a furnace wall, considering the arrangement of heat, and adjusting the physical setting in which the work could continue. This practical labour does not diminish the intellectual one. It complicates it in a useful way. Newton's questions had to survive contact with matter. A passage in a book could suggest an operation, but a vessel still had to stand in the room. A term could promise a transformation, but the substance itself might refuse to behave as expected. Heat could clarify one thing and obscure another. An experiment could end with an answer, a contradiction, a residue, or only a reason to begin again. Some chemical apparatus was designed for gentle persistence. A furnace associated with an even, sustained heat could turn the passing hours into part of the experiment. The work might continue while the reader sat nearby with a book, while a candle burned lower, while the college settled more deeply into night. Other moments involve the heavier work of metals in crucibles, where the visual language changes. Glass gives way to dense surfaces, muted gleams, dark residues, and the weight of materials that do not surrender their form easily. The workshop would also have required ordinary care. Fuel had to be managed, vessels had to be placed and removed, a cooled surface had to be examined, Tools had to be kept close enough to use without cluttering every movement. A note had to be written before memory blurred the sequence of observations. We do not need to invent a detailed procedure to understand the room's rhythm. The important thing is that attention moved continually between the fire, the vessel, and the page. There is a difference between a fire that creates a sudden display and a fire that becomes part of a long routine. Newton's laboratory belonged mostly to the second kind. Humphrey later remembered periods when the fire scarcely went out for weeks. That memory changes the atmosphere. The furnace was not merely lit for an evening demonstration. It could become a maintained presence, a low domestic star inside the workshop, asking for patience and dividing the night into quiet checks. Nearby objects would have taken on their own temporary climates. Brick closest to the heat would remain warm. Glass farther away would cool gradually. Metal might hold a dull reflection for a moment before returning to shadow. Ash would settle. The room would feel different at midnight than at dusk, and different again when outdoor light began to return. The college beyond the garden might sleep, wake, and move through another day while the laboratory preserved its smaller continuity. We can imagine Newton moving through that space with economy. There is no reason to picture hurried motion unless something specific required it. Much of the work would have rewarded stillness. He could inspect a crucible, turn toward the desk, compare a note, then look back toward the furnace. When something demanded adjustment, the movement would be practical. When nothing required intervention, waiting itself became a task. The substances in the room should also remain grounded. Metals, mineral materials, salts, and related preparations belong to the chemical world. Antimony will become especially important later, because Humphrey associated it with Newton's efforts. Mercury-related ideas appear frequently in alchemical traditions and in Newton's papers, but they need not become a list of hazardous instruction. For tonight's purposes, it is enough to notice the surfaces: a pale powder, a darkened residue, a metallic glint, a glass vessel clouded by use, and a crucible marked by heat. One can understand why old workshop spaces often acquire legends. A room lit by fire after midnight seems ready-made for dramatic stories. But the real atmosphere is more interesting when it remains restrained. The laboratory is not frightening, it is concentrated. The shadows come from ordinary light. The silence comes from patient work. The unanswered questions come not from a theatrical secret, but from the fact that the archive preserves only fragments of Newton's intentions and results. The arrangement of the room also reflects the limits of historical reconstruction. Humphrey provides a list and a location. The wider chemical culture provides vocabulary and context. Surviving papers reveal subjects and repeated interests, but no complete diagram allows us to place every vessel exactly where it stood on one particular evening. We should let the uncertainty remain visible. It makes the imagined visit more honest. We see enough to enter, not enough to rearrange the shelves. A candle may be burning near the desk now, adding a smaller and more fragile light to the furnace glow. The candle is useful for reading, but it also reminds us that paper shared the room with fire. Notes, copied passages, loose sheets, and books were vulnerable objects. Their survival depended on ordinary care and a little luck. Some would remain with Newton for years, some would be recopied, some might be lost, some would pass through later hands and wait centuries for scholars to understand their place in the larger archive. For the moment, one book lies open. Its pages have their own texture. The room is warm enough that the paper feels dry beneath the fingers. A line has been marked. Another waits to be copied. The fire continues its low work, but the next part of our journey moves toward the page. Newton's chemical workshop existed in paper as much as in brick and glass. A person could spend years beside furnaces and still need books, notes, indexes, and copied passages to make sense of what had been seen. In Newton's case, the textual labour became enormous. He read widely, he copied extensively, he compared authors, he compiled terms, He returned to old passages with new questions. He organised and reorganised a literature that resisted easy order. The surviving manuscripts show different forms of attention. Some are experimental notes, some are transcriptions from other writers, some gather excerpts under headings. Some move between English and Latin. Some preserve symbolic language whose meaning changes from one context to another. Some are unfinished. The archive does not present a polished final system. It presents work in progress, accumulated through decades of reading and experiment. One of the most revealing examples is Newton's Index Chemicus. The name means simply a chemical index. The surviving Index Chemicus is substantial, roughly 34,000 words spread across more than 100 pages. It gathers references to a large body of alchemical literature, often supplementing them with definitions, comments, and short reflections. The unfinished quality matters. An index of this kind is never merely a final product. It is a working instrument designed to return the reader to earlier passages when a term, material, or operation becomes newly important. The index belonged beside other large notebooks. One surviving volume of notes and experimental reports extends across hundreds of pages and ranges over decades, from the 1660s into the 1690s. Another group of notes appears to record Newton's own laboratory experiments during a winter stretch in the late 16th. These manuscripts show different scales of time. A single line might preserve one observation. A notebook might accompany years of changing interests. An index might grow whenever the literature demanded a new cross-reference. The manuscript catalogue itself creates a quiet sense of abundance. There are notes on George Ripley. There are extracts from different chemical authors. There are texts concerning philosophical Mercury. There are questions about the philosopher's stone. There are incomplete treatises on operations associated with transmutation. There are writings on the growth of metals and minerals. There are copied texts whose relationship to Newton's own beliefs remains uncertain. The archive is not one book, it is a working landscape. Humphrey Newton added one especially evocative detail. He remembered an old mouldy book lying in the laboratory and thought it was connected with Agricola and metals. His recollection is not precise enough to identify the volume with certainty. That uncertainty makes the image more believable. A workshop book need not be elegant. It can lie where it is useful, marked by damp, age, soot, and repeated handling. The name Agricola points toward the long practical tradition of writing about mining and metallurgy. Georgius Agricola's famous 16th century work on metals and mining described tools, ores, furnaces, and methods with a level of practical attention that made it influential far beyond its first publication. We should not claim that Humphrey identified the book correctly. We can simply notice what the memory suggests. Newton's paper world included not only allegorical texts but also material connected with the practical study of metals. An index becomes particularly important when language is unstable. Suppose a reader encounters Mars. In one context, Mars may refer to iron, Luna may suggest silver, Sol may refer to gold, Saturn may indicate lead. These planetary names belong to an older vocabulary linking metals with celestial bodies. Yet specialized writers could adapt terms in more particular ways, and a familiar label might carry a narrower meaning in one tradition than another. Cross-reference protects the reader from assuming too quickly. Newton's notes, therefore, contain a quieter kind of intellectual craftsmanship. He was making tools for thought. A list, index, or commonplace in arrangement can look less glamorous than an experiment, but it allows experiments to become comparable across time. It protects memory from the distortions of enthusiasm. It records where a phrase came from. It makes it possible to return to the right page after months or years. The paper itself records motion. A marginal addition shows that a thought returned later. A correction shows that a first wording was not enough. A copied passage shows that another author's language deserved attention. A blank space shows that organization remained unfinished. The manuscripts are not static objects. They are traces of Newton moving repeatedly through a difficult literature. For the listener, this gives the workshop a second kind of rhythm. The fire works slowly in matter. The index works slowly in language. A substance changes by degrees. A vocabulary clarifies by degrees. Neither path guarantees a final answer, but both reward the ability to return, yet its scale makes the simple name impressive. The surviving index runs to tens of thousands of words and many pages, drawing together references from a large body of alchemical literature. It is not the kind of object a person creates during a passing fascination. It reflects repeated consultation, sorting, cross-reference, and the desire to impose some order on a difficult field. Imagine the work slowly. A term appears in one author. Newton records the source and page. The same term reappears in another book, perhaps with a slightly different meaning or image. A note is added. A related process is listed elsewhere. Definitions accumulate, but complete clarity remains elusive. The index becomes a map of a landscape that cannot be viewed all at once. The books themselves carried histories. Newton owned or used works associated with writers such as George Ripley, Basil Valentine, Robert Boyle, and others. He read anthologies that gathered earlier texts together. Elias Ashmole's Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum presented English alchemical verse. Large collections such as the multi-volume Theatrum Chemicum preserved Latin writings from different periods. The American-born chemist George Starkey, who wrote under the name Irenaeus Philalethes, contributed influential texts to the 17th-century tradition. Each source offered fragments, claims, metaphors, and terms that could be compared against the rest. George Ripley is especially useful as an example of how strange the reading experience could be. His alchemical writing circulated in forms that demanded interpretation. Verse and symbolic language did not provide the clarity of a modern manual. A reader might move through images of dissolution, conjunction, death, rebirth, and colour change while trying to connect them with material operations. Newton copied and commented on writings associated with Ripley, not because every line can be taken as his personal belief, but because he judged the material worthy of sustained attention. The distinction matters. Copying is not agreement. A scholar may transcribe a passage in order to preserve it, test it, compare it, criticize it, or return to it later. Newton's notes should not be treated as a single confession of belief. They are evidence of labour. They show what occupied his attention and how persistently he worked through inherited material. They also show how much of his chemistry remained exploratory. Certain terms return with a peculiar vividness. The green lion, philosophical Mercury, Diana's doves, the caducean rod. These phrases can sound like the vocabulary of a dream, especially when read by firelight. Yet their obscurity should not encourage us to invent easy translations. A phrase might refer to a material, a state of a material, a process, an analogy, or a network of associations understood differently by different writers. Newton often had to navigate precisely that ambiguity. There is also a practical side to the symbolism. Secrecy could protect a craft. A writer who believed he possessed valuable knowledge might reveal only enough to guide the prepared reader. A reader without workshop experience could miss the point entirely. Some alchemical writing invites the patient interpreter and discourages the casual one. It may promise that nature's truths are simple only after one has learned how to see them. Newton's own habits suited that challenge. He was capable of prolonged comparison. He could take an old vocabulary seriously without accepting it carelessly. He could move between a page and an experiment, allowing each to question the other. The process was not linear. A copied excerpt might remain unused for years before becoming relevant. An observation might send him back toward an earlier book. A new manuscript might cause an old term to shift in meaning. The paper workshop continued upstairs when the fire did not need immediate attention. Newton's rooms could contain books opened beside loose sheets, notes arranged and rearranged, and pages written in a compressed hand. A question might begin near the furnace and follow him back to his desk. Another might begin in a book and lead him down the garden stairs. The boundary between study and a laboratory was crossed repeatedly. We can imagine the desk not as a place of perfect order, but as a place of working order. A marked volume lies beside a sheet of copied Latin. Another note waits to be expanded. A term in the margin points toward a related author. The candlelight is enough to read by. Beyond the room, the garden is dark. The laboratory fire continues low and steady, keeping time while the index grows by another line. There is a meditative quality in the repetition of this labour, but it is not empty repetition. Every return changes the map slightly. One source adds a definition, another complicates it. One observation appears to confirm a passage, another creates doubt. The point is not to circle without progress. It is to proceed carefully through a field where progress often looks like a more precise question. This is why the surviving archive feels so human. It does not show a mind receiving a single revelation. It shows a mind working. Pages accumulate because certainty is difficult. Notes multiply because the subject cannot be reduced quickly. An index grows because memory alone is not enough. The scholar returns to the same shelf because an older book may look different after a newer experiment. The fire is still there when we look up from the paper. Its glow has softened at the edge of the room, but it has not gone out. Outside, the season has begun to change. The evenings arrive a little earlier. The garden paths darken before the college day is fully finished. The work now asks for a different measure of time, not the turning of a page, but the long watch of a maintained flame. The long watches begin with the seasons. In spring, the air around Cambridge can still hold a damp coolness after sunset. The garden soil darkens beneath the evening moisture. New leaves appear gradually, not yet thick enough to hide the college walls. In autumn, the same path feels different. The day withdraws earlier. The air sharpens. Fallen leaves gather at the edges of the garden, and the warmth inside the laboratory becomes more distinct as soon as the door closes. Humphrey Newton later remembered that Isaac Newton gave roughly 6 weeks in spring and 6 weeks in autumn to concentrated work in the laboratory. During those periods, he said, the fire scarcely went out by day or night. He and Newton alternated the night watches until the experiments were finished. The detail is valuable partly because it is so simple. It does not preserve one spectacular event. It preserves duration. A maintained fire changes the meaning of time. At the start of the evening, there may still be a trace of colour beyond the garden. A few footsteps pass at a distance. The college is not yet fully quiet. Later, the edges of the room soften into shadow. A candle burns lower. An open book is set aside and opened again. The fire is checked. Nothing dramatic has occurred, but the work has continued. A night watch is not the same as a night of restless excitement. It can be almost domestic in its rhythm. Fuel must be tended. A vessel must remain where it belongs. A surface may need to be examined. A note may be made in a few words. Then there is waiting. The person in the room does not need to fill every minute. Attention is enough. Humphrey described Newton as accurate, strict, and exact in carrying out the chemical work. The phrasing suggests care rather than haste. It suggests that the workshop was governed by habits repeated often enough to become familiar, even if Humphrey could not fully understand the aims behind them. Newton did not explain every purpose to his assistant. Humphrey watched the labour from close range, while recognising that part of its meaning remained beyond him. That distance between shared work and private intention gives the laboratory its slightly lonely quality. Two people might sit awake beneath the same roof, hear the same faint sounds, and tend the same fire in turn, yet occupy different intellectual worlds. Humphrey could observe the vessel and the timing. He could copy a manuscript or carry out an ordinary task. He could see that the work mattered, but he could not enter every question Newton was asking. The room itself would shift as the hours passed. At dusk, glass catches the remaining daylight and the first candlelight together. Near midnight, the furnace becomes the dominant source of warmth. In the earliest morning, the black outside the doorway begins to thin, almost imperceptibly. Shapes in the garden return slowly. Brick, path, and wall emerge from shadow. Dawn does not announce a triumph, it simply joins the work already underway. This slow joining of lights is one of the quietest images in Newton's Cambridge life. The furnace glow is local and controlled, held within the laboratory. The morning light spreads across the garden without effort. For a while the two coexist. One belongs to art, in the old sense of human making and skilled practice. The other belongs to nature's ordinary cycle. The watcher, tired but attentive, stands between them. Humphrey also remembered Newton's broader habits of study. He often worked late. He sometimes neglected food when deeply occupied. A meal could remain untouched until someone drew his attention to it, after which he might eat only a little while, standing before returning to work. These details should not become a diagnosis, or a romantic ideal of genius. They are simply reminders that intense concentration has physical edges. A person still needs warmth, sleep, and food, even when thought makes those needs briefly recede from awareness. The college hall continued to have its meals, the chapel continued to have its hours. The streets beyond the college carried ordinary business. The garden required the gardener's attention. Newton's laboratory existed inside that wider life, but followed its own narrower rhythm during the chemical seasons. A person leaving the room at dawn might encounter a world beginning its day while feeling as though the previous night had never fully ended. There is no need to count every hour. Sleep-friendly history allows time to loosen. Let one spring evening rest beside one autumn evening. Let a candle shorten, then let another candle take its place. Let the fire settle slightly and then be tended. Let a page be turned without reading every line. Let rain touch the garden one night and let a clear sky appear on another. In spring, perhaps the path smells faintly of damp soil when the door opens. In autumn, perhaps the air carries the crispness of leaves and colder stone. These are imagined details, but they fit the seasonal frame without claiming more than the evidence allows. The documented core remains steady. For periods in spring and autumn, the fire was kept almost continuously alive, and the work required alternating watches. The repetition had purpose. Some changes could not be forced into a shorter span. A chemical observer had to accept that matter possessed its own pace. The furnace might create the conditions, but time still performed part of the work. This made patience practical. Waiting was not empty space between experiments. Waiting was woven into the experiment itself. A person who spends enough hours near a maintained fire begins to notice small variations. The sound of fuel shifting, the way heat reaches one side of the room more strongly than another, the difference between a vessel recently removed and one that has cooled, the shade of a residue seen by candlelight and again by morning light. The point at which a book grows harder to read because tiredness has softened the focus of the eyes. Newton's surviving notes suggest a mind attentive to distinctions. He recorded, compared and revised. The long watches offered a setting for that temperament. Their quiet would allow a faint alteration to become visible. Their regularity would allow one observation to be compared with another. Their demands would also impose limits. Fatigue could distort judgment. A vessel could disappoint expectations. A term copied from a book could prove less clear in practice than it seemed on the page. Humphrey's memory is retrospective. He wrote after the Cambridge years had passed, when Newton's fame had already grown. His recollections are precious because he had been there, but they are still memories, shaped by time and by the knowledge of whom he had served. It is best to receive them gently. We do not need to transform every detail into a perfect transcript of one night. We can let them establish a pattern. The pattern is enough. Spring and autumn, firelight and early morning. The assistant sitting up one night, Newton the next. The garden cooling outside, the crucibles used more than some of the other vessels. The scholar returning from a brief walk with a thought that sends him rapidly upstairs. The same building seen in different weather. The same questions returning in altered forms. In the most restful histories, an ordinary routine can reveal more than a dramatic scene. Here, the routine tells us that Newton's chemistry was not ornamental. It required time, labour, materials, and concentration. It belonged to the calendar of his life. When the leaves changed, the laboratory changed with them. Now another evening has begun. A crucible sits nearer the fire. Its surface is dull and practical, darkened by use. Within the room's softer rhythm, it introduces a denser question. What did Newton hope to learn from metals? And why did antimony hold such importance in the work Humphrey remembered? A crucible has an unassuming shape. It is made to endure heat rather than attract attention. When empty and cool, it seems almost plain enough to overlook. Yet once placed near the furnace, it becomes the centre of a small field of care. A substance rests within it. Heat gathers. Time passes. The observer waits for change. Humphrey Newton later wrote that crucibles were the apparatus used most in Isaac Newton's laboratory during the periods he witnessed. He associated them with the fusing of metals. He also remembered antimony as an important ingredient in the work and believed that the transmutation of metals was Newton's chief design. Humphrey was careful about the limits of his knowledge. He could see the labour and the materials, but he could not fully penetrate Newton's aim. That balance is worth preserving. It would be easy to reduce the workshop to a single sentence. Newton tried to make gold. There is truth near that statement, but the full picture is more interesting. Chrysopoeia, the hoped-for making of gold from less precious materials, was one strand of early modern chemistry. Newton engaged seriously with that strand. Yet his manuscripts also explore wider questions about matter, generation, mineral growth, active processes, and substances described through the specialized vocabulary of chemical tradition. Antimony occupied an important place in that world. It is a metallic-looking element, brittle rather than soft, and known in different compounds and preparations long before Newton's time. Chemists paid attention to it for practical, medical, and transmutational reasons. In our imagined visit, it is enough to notice its physical presence without turning the narration into a recipe. It belongs to the weight and opacity of the workshop. It is one of the materials through which Newton asked questions that the archive does not always allow us to answer neatly. Metals encouraged ambitious theories because they visibly changed under human handling. Heat could alter their appearance. Combination and separation could produce new colours, textures, residues and forms. A shiny surface could darken. A dull material could acquire a different gleam. A solid mass could become fluid under sufficient heat and then return to solidity as it cooled. To a careful observer without modern atomic theory, these changes offered real evidence that matter possessed hidden capacities. The underground origin of metals added another layer of suggestion. Many early modern thinkers imagined minerals and metals developing within the earth over time. The language of growth came naturally. A metal might be considered immature or imperfect, its development influenced by the conditions in which it formed. If nature could bring a substance toward a more complete state slowly, perhaps art might assist the process, under controlled conditions. The laboratory became a compressed landscape, a place where the operations of nature might be studied, imitated, or encouraged. The hope was not foolish merely because later science answered the question differently. It was rooted in visible transformations and incomplete knowledge. We know today that chemical reactions do not turn one element into another through ordinary laboratory methods. Newton did not possess that framework. He inhabited a period when the classification of substances, the explanation of change, and the boundaries of possibility remained open in different ways. This is where historical balance matters. We should neither mock the question nor pretend the hoped-for result was achieved. There is no good evidence that Newton successfully transmuted base metal into gold or found a philosopher's stone. His papers show effort, comparison, and sustained interest. They do not hand us a final triumphant procedure. Their unfinished quality is part of the story. The philosopher's stone itself was not merely a convenient object in every alchemical tradition. Depending on the writer, it could represent a powerful agent of transformation, the outcome of a difficult process, a medicine, or an idea layered with philosophical and religious meaning. Newton copied and studied texts that address such themes, but his exact conclusions are not reducible to one line. The symbolic language resists that kind of flattening. Philosophical mercury provides another example. The name sounds familiar because ordinary mercury was a known substance, recognizable by its silvery fluid appearance. But alchemical writers often meant something more complex when they used the philosophical term. It might refer to a prepared material, a principle, a stage, or an interpretive key within a larger process. Newton's notes engage with this vocabulary, including passages about preparations associated with philosophical mercury. For our purposes, the significance lies in the reading and inquiry, not in reconstructing a hazardous operation. The manuscripts also include material concerned with the vegetative growth of metals and minerals. The phrase can sound strange now, but it belongs to an effort to understand the active processes of nature. Vegetation did not mean only leaves and stems. It could provide a model for development more generally: hidden seeds, gradual formation, growth from within, and the unfolding of a substance toward a characteristic form. Imagine Newton watching a crucible cool and asking not only what has happened, but what kind of happening it is. Is the visible change merely a surface alteration? Has one substance separated from another? Has a hidden component become exposed? Has heat accelerated a natural process? Does an old author's symbolic phrase illuminate the observation or only confuse it? Each question leads to another. There is a useful humility in the crucible. It does not answer on command, it reveals only what the observer can recognize. A residue may appear significant and later prove ordinary. A colour may seem promising and refuse to return in the next trial. A text may appear clear until the vessel contradicts it. Hope has to coexist with exactness. Humphrey remembered Newton as exact in performance. That description matters most when placed beside the ambitious subject. Newton was not merely daydreaming about gold. He was working with materials, maintaining fires, altering furnaces, comparing texts, and accepting the slow demands of repeated observation. The aim may have reached beyond what ordinary chemistry could accomplish, but the labour remained practical. The room feels different when metal occupies the centre. Glass reflects, paper rustles, metal weights. The crucible is heavier than the vocabulary surrounding it. Its weight keeps the story grounded. However elaborate the text, however vivid the symbol, there is still a vessel near the fire, and a substance that must cool before it can be examined safely. When the heat has receded, the real work continues. Newton looks, compares, and writes. A result is not valuable merely because it happened. It becomes useful only when observed with enough care to distinguish what has changed from what has merely appeared to change. The crucible has brought us to the next part of the workshop, the practice of attention. Observation in a 17th-century laboratory did not begin with a modern instrument panel or a printed readout. It began with the senses, trained by repetition and corrected by comparison. The eye noticed colour and texture. The hand, used cautiously and at the proper distance from heat, understood weight and material resistance. Smell could alert a practitioner to the presence of volatile substances, though the historical workshop also carried risks that modern safety standards would rightly treat with far greater care. Sound, timing, and the behaviour of a vessel could matter as well. Newton's work should not be romanticised as safe merely because the room is quiet. Early modern chemistry involved substances and fumes that require caution. Tonight's narration remains descriptive rather than instructional. We do not need to recreate an operation to understand the patience required by it. It is enough to watch from the threshold as the vessel cools and the observer reaches for paper. A brief note might record the appearance of a material, the timing of a change, the response to heat, or the difference between one trial and another. The words could be compressed because they were written for private use. Newton did not always need to explain to a future reader what he understood in the moment. That private shorthand is one reason the manuscripts can remain challenging. The archive preserves marks of thought without always preserving a full explanation. The sequence of attention matters. First there is expectation, drawn from a book, a prior experiment, or a broader theory. Early modern observation was not a simple act of looking. It was a learned discipline shaped by their vocabulary, workshop experience, and the quality of the available light. The same residue might appear different when viewed by candlelight, furnace glow, or the pale light of morning. A fine deposit could be missed if the glass was clouded. A colour could be described differently by two observers. An odour might be noticed strongly by one person, and only faintly by another. The observer needed patience not only with the substance but with the limits of the senses. This is one reason repetition mattered. A single trial could mislead. A material might behave differently because the heat was uneven, the vessel was imperfect, or the starting substance varied. The 17th century workshop lacked the standardized reagents and instruments that later laboratories would rely upon. Even a careful worker faced uncertainty in the objects themselves. A named substance purchased from one source might not match another example exactly. Newton's reported habit of altering his own brick furnaces fits this practical world. Heat was not an abstract number displayed on a screen. It had to be inferred and managed through experience. The behaviour of the fire, the position of the vessel, the material of the furnace, and the passing of time all mattered. The observer learned patterns through accumulated contact rather than through a single perfect measurement. The notebook helped compensate. Writing allowed the private observer to externalize memory. A colour description, a date, a small comparison, or a brief remark could become the starting point for a later reconsideration. The value of the note was not always obvious at the moment of writing. Its usefulness might emerge only when another page, months later, revealed a similarity or contradiction. The old planetary names for metals made interpretation more delicate. Sol, the sun, commonly indicated gold. Lunar, the moon, indicated silver. Mars suggested iron. Venus suggested copper. Saturn suggested lead. Jupiter suggested tin. Mercury carried its own complicated identity, both as a familiar metal and as part of a larger symbolic vocabulary. These names did not make the workshop magical. They were inherited labels, embedded in a tradition that joined observation to analogy. Some writers used cover names deliberately. A deck name or hidden name concealed the identity of a substance or operation from the casual reader. To understand a text, Newton might have to determine whether a familiar word was being used ordinarily, symbolically, or as a specific clue within a particular author's system. The paper workshop and the physical workshop therefore depended on one another. Mistaken interpretation of a word could send the material work in the wrong direction. A stubborn result in the crucible could expose a mistaken interpretation of the word. The uncertainty did not make observation useless. It made good observation more demanding. Newton's seriousness is visible not only in the number of pages he wrote, but in the willingness to remain with difficult material across years. He could allow one result to remain provisional. He could accumulate evidence without pretending that every question had been settled. There is a restful honesty in that approach. The room does not ask us to celebrate every residue or decode every symbol. It asks us to recognize the texture of careful uncertainty. The fire is steady, the vessel cools, the page receives a note. The observer does not know everything, but he knows enough to look again. Then there is the material event. Then comes interpretation. The event does not interpret itself. A colour change can be noticed without being fully understood. A residue can be weighed in the mind against a copied passage. An apparent confirmation may dissolve when another trial behaves differently. This is a good place to resist the urge for constant conclusions. The workshop is interesting because certainty arrives unevenly. Newton's notes did not all become publications. Some questions remained private. Some trials may have led nowhere. Some copied claims may have been set aside. Some observations may have joined a larger pattern, only after years of reconsideration. The rhythm of careful observation can be sleep-friendly, because it asks little of the listener except presence. A vessel cools, the garden darkens, a page receives a line, the fire settles and is checked. Another page is opened. Nothing needs to surprise us. The value lies in the narrowing of attention. Newton's broader scientific work also depended on attention to distinctions. In optics, he studied the behaviour of light with an insistence that appearances be tested and separated. In mathematics, he pursued relationships that required exact reasoning. In chemistry, the materials were more resistant to orderly presentation, and the inherited vocabulary was often more obscure. Yet the habit of close comparison remained recognizable. It would be too simple to claim that one field trained the other in a direct line. The relationship is more subtle. The same person inhabited both practices. The same notebooks could contain neighbouring observations. The same patients with difficult phenomena could appear in different forms. A mind does not always divide its methods according to the chapter headings a later age prefers. Consider the smallest possible scene. The fire has burned through another portion of fuel. The crucible has been removed and allowed to rest. Newton examines what remains. The result is not dramatic enough for a legend. Perhaps it is only a shade darker than expected. Perhaps a texture differs from the previous trial. Perhaps nothing useful has happened at all. He writes a note anyway, because an unpromising result can still protect the future from repetition. That is how a private archive grows. Not every line is a discovery. Many lines are acts of memory. They preserve the fact that a path was tried, a term was encountered, a colour was noticed, or a question had not yet been resolved. When historians later read those pages, they do not find a simple map to a lost treasure. They find the sediment of attention. The phrase suits the workshop. Ash settles on one surface while notes accumulate on another. Each is a residue of time. Each can be brushed aside carelessly or examined for what it reveals. Newton's chemical papers survived in uneven condition, scattered across collections and categories, but they retain this quality. They invite slow reading because they were made through slow work. Humphrey's presence becomes more noticeable now. Somewhere in the room the assistant has watched the same hours pass. He has tended the fire on alternate nights. He has seen Newton move between chamber, garden, and a laboratory. He has copied one of the most important mathematical books ever published without pretending to understand every part of the private work beside the furnace. The next step is to let him come more fully into view. Humphrey Newton enters the record quietly. He was no relation to Isaac Newton, despite the shared surname. In late 1683, through the mediation of a schoolmaster at Grantham, he came to Cambridge to serve as Newton's assistant and amanuensis. An amanuensis was a person who helped with the labour of writing, copying, carrying messages, organising practical tasks, and making it possible for a scholar's work to move from private manuscript toward a wider world. Humphrey remained with Newton for roughly 5 years, through the period in which the Principia was written and published. His later recollections give us something rare. Newton left an enormous archive, but private papers do not always tell us how a room felt while the writing was being done. Humphrey remembered the habits around the papers. He remembered copying the Principia before it went to the press. He remembered delivering presentation copies after publication. He remembered Newton's concentration, his sparse meals, the late hours, the garden, the telescope, the laboratory, and the alternating watches by the fire. Humphrey's account was written after the fact, when he'd been asked to recollect his former employer. He admitted the limits of memory. Had he known that future readers would care so deeply about the details he suggested, he might have observed more carefully. This makes his testimony more appealing rather than less. He does not pretend to have understood everything. He gives us fragments, practical and personal, while recognizing that part of Newton's inner life remained inaccessible. The assistant's place in the workshop was unusual. He was close enough to see the crucibles and furnaces, close enough to take turns through the night, yet far enough from Newton's reasoning to wonder what the experiments were for. He believed the goal reached towards something beyond ordinary skill, but he could not say with certainty what Newton expected. The distinction matters. A witness may observe effort precisely while interpreting motive only imperfectly. Imagine Humphrey arriving for his turn in the laboratory. Outside, the college has quieted. The garden path is dark except where a small light reaches it from the doorway. Inside, the room has already been warmed by hours of attention. A book is present but not necessarily open. A crucible rests near the furnace. Newton gives whatever practical instruction is needed and steps away, perhaps upstairs toward the desk, perhaps only to another part of the room. The assistant remains with the fire. There is companionship in that scene, but it is companionship at a distance. The two men share responsibility rather than conversation. Humphrey is not invited into every interpretation. Newton's attention has narrowed toward work that may be difficult to explain before it is complete. Silence is not hostility, it is simply the natural atmosphere of a room in which waiting matters. Humphrey also remembered Newton's manner as mild, sedate, and humble during these years. He described a person of profound thought who rarely seemed angry. Such recollections should not be used to create a flawless portrait. Every remembered character is selective, but they soften the image of the remote genius. The Newton of the laboratory is not shouting at assistants or staging displays. He is absorbed, often quiet and intensely economical with his time. This economy could make ordinary routines appear strange. Humphrey reported finding food untouched because Newton had forgotten to eat. When reminded, Newton might take only a little while standing rather than sit down for a proper private meal. On occasions when he intended to dine in hall, he could become distracted and turn the wrong way. Such anecdotes gathered around Newton in later biography because they fit the familiar theme of absent-minded concentration. They are best received lightly. The point is not to make him eccentric for entertainment. The point is to notice how fully his thoughts could occupy him. The garden offered brief release. Humphrey remembered it as carefully maintained by a gardener. Newton did not spend his days pruning or digging. He might take a short turn or two, stop suddenly, and return rapidly upstairs when an idea occurred. The image has an almost musical rhythm, a slow path, a pause, quick steps, and then writing at a standing desk before the thought fades. Nearby, the telescope waited at the head of the stairs leading down toward the garden, directed eastward. Humphrey estimated it at roughly 5 feet in length. The instrument creates a gentle contrast with the furnace. One asked the eye to look far beyond the college walls. The other asked the observer to look closely at matter under heat. Between them lies the garden path, crossed by the same person. Humphrey also noticed Newton's few visitors. Newton did not cultivate a constant social round. He rarely went visiting and received only a small circle. Among the people Humphrey named was Giovanni Francesco Vigani, a chemist whose company Newton particularly enjoyed in the evening. A visit from Vigani allows us to imagine the laboratory not as permanently silent, but as occasionally conversational. A question could be discussed. A book might be mentioned. A practical observation could be compared with someone else's experience. We should not reconstruct those conversations too confidently. Their details are lost. Vigani's presence tells us enough. Newton's chemistry did not exist solely inside his own notebooks. It belonged to a living culture in which knowledge passed through people as well as pages. The visitor arriving at dusk might bring a perspective unavailable in a printed text. The exchange could be brief, selective, and still meaningful. Humphrey's own role was different from Vigani's. He was not remembered primarily as a chemical interlocutor. He was the steady assistant, the copyist, the person nearby while Newton's work moved through an especially important period. He offers a view from the edge of the room. Because he did not fully understand the grand purpose, his recollections preserve the practical surface with unusual clarity. One of his observations also helps us resist a later legend. Humphrey wrote that Newton kept neither dog nor cat in his chamber. This matters because later stories would attach a dog named Diamond to a tale of burned papers. We will return to that uncertain tradition near the end of the episode. For now, the absence of an animal gives the room a simpler quiet. The sounds are the sounds of work. Fuel shifting, a vessel set down, paper moved, footsteps on the stairs. Humphrey's recollections do not need to carry the entire story. They are one window among many. Newton's papers, library, correspondence, and later archival history each reveal something different. Still, without Humphrey, the laboratory would be much harder to picture. He places it near the garden. He remembers the seasonal fires. He names the crucibles, the metals, the brick furnaces, and the telescope. He remembers Newton's exactness and his delight in the work. The word delight is worth pausing over. The laboratory was demanding. The hours were long. Results were uncertain. Yet Humphrey remembered Newton working there with satisfaction. The room was not merely a burden or a strange obligation. It was one of the places where Newton wanted to be. The assistant's night watch continues for another hour. Somewhere above, Newton may be writing. A bell sounds faintly from farther away. The garden is still. The telescope remains pointed toward the eastern sky. The fire is checked again. When the room widens next, it will do so through a knock at the door, a visitor's arrival, a parcel of books, or a folded letter carried from a larger learned world. Private work is not the same as isolated work. Newton guarded much of his chemical inquiry and did not publish a complete account of it, but the laboratory was connected to a network of reading, correspondence, gifts, visitors, and trusted exchanges. The room near the garden had walls, yet ideas passed through them regularly. Begin with a book arriving in Cambridge. It has travelled through ordinary channels, a bookseller, a colleague, a gift, or a parcel. The binding may be new or already worn. The pages may contain practical reports, philosophical arguments, or dense compilations of earlier authors. Before the book reaches the laboratory table, it may spend weeks upstairs in Newton's rooms. He reads, marks a passage, folds a corner, or copies lines onto another sheet. Later, one note follows him down the stairs. Newton's library included works connected with chemistry and natural philosophy, among them books by Robert Boyle. Boyle was one of the central experimental figures of the 17th century, known for a wide range of investigations and for his attention to the evidentiary value of experiments. His interests cannot be reduced to a single modern discipline. He wrote on chemical topics, medicine, air, matter, and the practices by which claims about nature should be tested and communicated. A book from Boyle, or a book about Boyle's experiments, would not have been a decorative possession. Newton owned works showing signs of use, including dog-eared pages. The physical marks matter because they bring reading closer to labour. A turned corner says that a passage deserved return. A marginal note says that reading was active. A gift inscription says that knowledge moved through relationships. The wider chemical network included more guarded forms of communication as well. In the early 1690s, after Boyle's death, John Locke was among those dealing with Boyle's manuscript legacy. Locke sent Newton copies of 2 alchemical recipes found among Boyle's papers. The exchange is revealing even when we leave the recipes undescribed. It shows trusted knowledge passing quietly between people better known today for other accomplishments. Locke, the philosopher of the essay concerning human understanding, and Newton, the mathematician and natural philosopher, could correspond about chemistry without feeling that they had crossed into a separate universe. The correspondence also illustrates the selective circulation of knowledge. A manuscript recipe could be valuable, incomplete, difficult to interpret, or intentionally withheld from a wider audience. Newton himself sometimes wished to keep his involvement private. The reasons may include caution, unfinished work, the guarded traditions of chemistry, and his personal reluctance to expose uncertain claims to public controversy. A letter offered a narrower path than publication. There were earlier relationships as well. John Wickens became Newton's chamber fellow during the Cambridge years, and remained associated with him for a long period. The story of their shared rooms belongs more to Newton's broader college life than to one particular chemical experiment, but it reminds us that his environment changed over time. The laboratory was not a timeless chamber sealed from biography. Roommates departed, assistants arrived, books accumulated, a telescope was positioned near the stairs. Different questions came forward in different years. Then there was Vigani, the evening visitor remembered by Humphrey. Giovanni Francesco Vigani was a chemist of Italian origin who taught at Cambridge and became known for instruction in chemistry. Later accounts connect him with a laboratory at Trinity. His presence in Newton's circle should remain gently drawn. We do not need to invent a long dialogue. A few evenings of conversation are enough to break the illusion of absolute solitude. Imagine a visit without forcing its content. The garden door opens. Cooler air enters briefly. A coat is set aside. The room has the slight disorder of active work. Newton and Vigani exchange observations. Perhaps a recent book is mentioned. Perhaps the behaviour of a metal or a preparation is discussed in broad terms. Humphrey moves quietly at the edge of the space. The conversation rises and falls. Then the visitor leaves, and the laboratory returns to its narrower rhythm. A bookseller could also matter. The 17th-century republic of letters depended on printers, publishers, carriers, librarians and sellers who moved objects from place to place. The great questions of nature often travelled in paper parcels. A newly acquired volume might preserve a medieval author in a later edition. A manuscript copy might carry a text unavailable in print. An anthology could place conflicting traditions side by side. Newton's intellectual world was built partly from these ordinary acts of circulation. There is comfort in noticing the material path of ideas. A letter must be folded, a seal must be broken, a book must be opened, a page must be found. Knowledge does not arrive as pure abstraction. It arrives with paper, ink, bindings, handwriting, stains, and delays. It enters the workshop through human hands. Not every connection was close friendship. Historical restraint matters here too. A letter proves a correspondence, not perfect intimacy. A gift proves a gesture, not complete agreement. A visit proves access, not a fully shared philosophy. Newton could read an author attentively while disagreeing with parts of the work. He could copy a recipe without performing it. He could receive a visitor without explaining the most private corners of his inquiry. The network remained selective. Newton did not send every thought outward. Some pages stayed on the desk. Some copied passages were arranged for his own use. Some experiments were witnessed only at the level of apparatus and routine. This uneven circulation is part of what makes the archive compelling. It contains doors within doors. A printed book leads to a marginal note. A marginal note leads to a private index. A private index leads back toward a crucible. A letter from Locke leads back toward Boyle's papers and forward toward another set of guarded questions. The room near the garden becomes larger when viewed this way. Its shelves connect to London, to earlier English writers, to Latin compilations printed on the continent, to practical traditions carried by artisans, and to learned correspondents exchanging sheets of paper. Yet the room does not lose its intimate scale. The visitor still has to cross the threshold. The letter still rests in Newton's hand. The book still lies open beside the fire. The network also helps explain why the word secret should be used softly. Manuscript culture allowed several levels of privacy. A text could be copied for one trusted reader without being printed for hundreds. A recipe could circulate in a letter. A book could be loaned with the expectation of return. A visitor could describe an experiment verbally and leave no written trace. A scholar could write an index for personal use, preserving the sources while revealing nothing publicly about the conclusions drawn from them. This made the movement of the knowledge slower but sometimes more intimate. Handwriting carried the presence of a particular person. Marginal notes preserved the moment when a reader paused. Paper folded for a letter created a physical boundary around the message. A seal indicated that the contents were meant to travel intact between chosen hands. The chemical world often depended on this careful narrowing of audience. Printing did not remove manuscript exchange. It existed beside it. Printed anthologies made older text available to more readers, but private copies, extracts, corrections, and recipes continued to pass from person to person. Newton could purchase a book, copy from another, receive a sheet, or preserve a passage from a manuscript tradition. Each route shaped what he encountered. The distinction between public and private also affected tone. A printed book often presents an argument with confidence because it seeks readers. A notebook can emit uncertainty more freely. A letter can ask a question without pretending to settle it. An index can gather contradictions without resolving them. Newton's archive contains all these different registers, which is one reason it cannot be summarized honestly as a single doctrine. This slow travel of paper also made memory important. A reader waiting for a response might return to an older volume. A recipe arriving months later could illuminate a phrase copied years earlier. A visitor's evening conversation might send Newton back to a dog-eared page. Intellectual progress could happen through delayed recognition, rather than immediate discovery. This pattern suits the workshop's pace. Nothing arrives instantly. The letter crosses distance. The parcel is opened. The book is marked. The furnace is tended. The observation is recorded. The next question waits until another source appears. The network is larger than the shed, but it moves with the same patience. Newton's chemistry was private, but it was not wholly solitary or unknown. He participated in a culture where discretion was normal, where manuscripts passed through trusted channels, and where publication was only one way knowledge could move. A secret might be partial. It might be a matter of timing. It might be a question held back because the answer was incomplete. When the letter is folded again, the room grows quiet. The books remain. The furnace remains. The next question is more difficult to phrase. How did this chemical world stand beside Newton's studies of light, matter, motion, and the invisible structures of nature? The answer cannot be reduced to one cause, but the proximity itself is worth exploring. There are two kinds of light in Newton's story. One is the warm local glow of the laboratory, fire touching brick, glass, metal, and the edges of a page. The other is the divided band of colour produced when a beam of light passes through a prism. One belongs to the furnace, the other belongs to optics. They should not be blended into a single metaphor too quickly, yet they belong to the same scholar's world. Newton's studies of light are among his most celebrated achievements. He experimented with prisms, lenses, colours, reflection, and refraction. He argued that white light contains rays with different degrees of refrangibility, so that a prism separates colours already present rather than creating colour out of simplicity. His published optics would later make these investigations accessible to a wider audience. The darkened room, the beam entering through a small opening, and the spectrum appearing on a surface have become some of the most recognisable images in the history of science. The laboratory seems at first to offer a different atmosphere. Its light is not analysed into colours, it is used to maintain heat, illuminate tools, and permit reading after sunset. Its objects are heavier. A prism can be lifted toward a beam. A crucible sits close to the furnace. Yet both settings reward the same refusal to trust a first appearance completely. White light is not as simple as it seems. A metal surface does not reveal every process taking place within it. Visible effects invite questions about less visible structures. The surviving papers make the boundary even less tidy. Scholars working with Newton's manuscripts have emphasized that chemical recipes, optical observations, and physical reflections can appear near one another in his notebooks. This does not prove that every optical discovery grew from alchemy, or that every chemical note shaped the Principia. It does show that Newton himself did not always separate his inquiries according to modern archival shelves. Around 1675, Newton wrote a hypothesis concerning light and colours. A material related to nature's processes in vegetation belongs to nearby intellectual terrain. Historians have examined the ways his chemical interests may have informed his thinking about active processes, particles, attraction, repulsion, growth, and the operations of matter. The interpretation remains complex. It would be misleading to claim that a single furnace experiment unlocked universal gravitation. It would be equally misleading to pretend that the workshop had no relationship at all to Newton's effort to understand nature. The most balanced approach is to let the questions stand beside one another. Newton looked at a beam of light and asked how its visible appearance arose. He looked at metals and mineral substances and asked how their changes should be understood. He studied motion mathematically. He read theological texts with a different but equally intense attention. He later managed practical questions at the Royal Mint. The breadth can feel surprising only because later categories encourage us to expect narrower lives. An early modern natural philosopher could pursue unity across apparently different domains. The world was not assumed to be a collection of unrelated facts. Its patterns might share causes, analogies, or principles. Growth in plants, formation in minerals, chemical affinity, optical effect, and celestial motion were not identical questions, but each could provoke a deeper inquiry into hidden order. The danger for a modern narrator is to force the unity into a system clearer than Newton ever wrote. The opportunity is to recognize that he searched for connections. The word hidden should also remain calm. A hidden process is not necessarily mysterious in the sensational sense. It may simply be one that cannot be seen directly. We observe an effect and infer a structure. We watch a change and ask what produced it. Newton's best-known work often proceeds through this tension between the visible and the inferred. Chemistry offered its own version of the same tension, although its vocabulary and evidentiary problems were different. Imagine two rooms separated by a stair. In one, sunlight is admitted carefully into a darkened chamber, and a prism reveals a sequence of colours. In another, an elaboratory fire warms brick and glass, while a metal cools inside a crucible. The rooms do not provide the same kind of evidence, they do not lead to the same kind of theory. But the movement between them belongs to one life. The notebooks preserve that movement in material form. A page can contain observations that later readers would sort into separate subjects. A margin can place one thought unexpectedly close to another. The 19th century classification of Newton's archive would later divide mathematics, chemistry, theology, chronology, and other areas into categories useful to editors, but not always faithful to the original web of inquiry. Newton's own papers sometimes resist shelves because his questions crossed them. There is a caution here. It can be tempting to transform Newton's alchemy into a glamorous hidden origin for everything famous. Such a story is too neat. The Principia required mathematical arguments, astronomical data, correspondence, and years of development. The optical work had its own experimental history. Chemistry was not a secret machine producing each result. It was one serious strand within a much larger intellectual life. The opposite caution matters too. For a long time, admirers of Newton found the alchemical papers embarrassing or irrelevant. They preferred a purified portrait, the great rational thinker with the furnace quietly removed from the background. That portrait is also too neat. The documents remain, the years of copying remain, the seasonal watches remain, the crucibles and the index chemicus remain. A fuller Newton must include them. Perhaps the elaboratory mattered not because it contained one lost answer, but because it sustained a habit of attention. It placed Newton before processes that unfolded gradually and incompletely. It encouraged comparison between text and matter. It made patience unavoidable. It offered a practical encounter with transformation, ambiguity, and the limits of first impressions. The prism light and the furnace glow can remain distinct as we leave them. One creates a narrow spectrum on a surface. The other recedes against warm brick. Between them lies a scholar's desk, crowded with private questions. The next question concerns privacy itself. Why did so much of this work remain behind closed doors and unpublished pages? Privacy in Newton's workshop begins with something ordinary. An unfinished page. A note made for private use does not need to be shown to the world. It can remain beside the book that prompted it, written in a shorthand its author understands, waiting for a later experiment or a clearer thought. Not every question seeks an audience immediately. Some questions need a room of their own. Newton's chemical papers were largely private in this sense. They were not arranged as a complete public textbook or published as a final account of his conclusions. They include drafts, excerpts, transcriptions, indexes, experimental reports, and fragments. Their forms suggest extended work rather than one polished statement. To call them secret is reasonable as long as the word remains gentle. The secrecy was not necessarily the secrecy of a locked chamber or a forbidden revelation. It was the secrecy of selective circulation, unfinished thought, guarded tradition, and personal reserve. Alchemy had long cultivated guarded language. Writers could conceal practical information through allegory, substitution, symbolic imagery, and indirect phrasing. A process might be described through the language of marriage, death, rebirth, kings, queens, lions, birds, planets, or mythic figures. The reader was expected to interpret. Those who believed valuable knowledge should not be offered carelessly to everyone could treat obscurity as a form of protection. This protection had practical dimensions. A useful preparation might have commercial value. A claimed medical remedy might confer reputation or income. A hoped-for method of transmutation, if genuine, would seem too consequential to broadcast casually. But secrecy could also carry moral meaning. Some traditions presented deep knowledge as something granted only to the patient, disciplined, and worthy. An obscure text might test the reader's discernment as much as explain an operation. Newton inherited that guarded textual world. He copied it, indexed it, and tried to sort it. His own notes sometimes retained symbolic language. He could be cautious in correspondence. When dealing with chemical material connected with Boyle, he did not always want his role widely advertised. The exact reasons varied with circumstance, and it would be unwise to reduce them to one motive. but the pattern fits a person who often preferred controlled exchange over public exposure. Newton's reluctance to publish was not limited to chemistry. His optical work entered public debate and drew criticism, which helped make him wary of controversy. His mathematical work circulated unevenly before the Principia. His theological views remained largely private. He wrote extensively in several areas without preparing every manuscript for print. Publication was not the automatic destination of every page. The culture of print itself could be demanding. Once a claim entered public circulation, it invited response, correction, misunderstanding, rivalry, and dispute. A private notebook allowed uncertainty to remain productive. A copied excerpt could wait without being defended. A theory could remain incomplete. An experiment could be recorded without becoming a promise. There is a difference between secrecy and silence. Newton was not silent about every related subject. He read widely, exchanged letters, received selected visitors, and participated in the broader world of natural philosophy. Some of his later published writing, especially the questions appended to editions of the Optics, reveals a continuing interest in forces, matter, and the less visible processes of nature. Yet the specific archive of chemistry remained mostly behind the scenes. The workshop title, then, should not make us imagine a secret door concealed behind a bookcase. The doorway is ordinary. It opens toward the garden. The privacy lies in the fact that relatively few people knew the scale of what was being attempted. Fewer understood its aims, and the papers themselves remained inaccessible or poorly understood for generations. Humphrey Newton's recollections demonstrate the difference clearly. He entered the laboratory. He tended the fire. He saw the crucibles and metals. He watched Newton build and alter brick furnaces. Yet even he wrote that he could not penetrate the purpose of the work. Physical access did not equal intellectual access. The room could be shared while the question remained private. The symbolic texts added another layer. A copied passage might appear obscure even to a determined reader. One writer could use a term differently from another. The green lion in one context might not map cleanly onto the green lion in another. Philosophical mercury might shift in meaning as a process developed. Newton's Index Chemicus offered order, but the order remained the order of an ongoing search. It is possible to imagine the closed notebook at the end of a watch. The last line has been written. The ink is still drying. The page does not announce itself as a discovery. It does not explain which questions will matter years later. Newton closes the cover, sets the book aside, and returns his attention to the furnace. Privacy is not an event. It is a condition of the work. There may also have been reputational caution, although it should be phrased carefully. By the later 17th century, alchemy carried mixed associations. It attracted serious inquiry, but it also attracted suspicion. Claims of easy gold-making could invite fraud. Elaborate promises could conceal failure. A learned practitioner might distinguish his own careful work from public boasting and still avoid publishing a subject vulnerable to misunderstanding. Newton's private theology offers a parallel of a different kind. He wrote extensively on scripture, prophecy, church history, and doctrine while keeping views outside the religious mainstream largely unpublished. Chemistry and theology were not the same inquiry, but both demonstrate how much of Newton's intellectual life remained beyond his public books. The famous portrait represents a real achievement. It is simply incomplete. The incompleteness lasted well beyond his death. For generations, readers encountered the Newton of the Principia, optics, gravity, and mathematics more readily than the Newton of vast unpublished chemical manuscripts. The public image hardened, while the private archive remained dispersed, restricted, categorized, or neglected. A room that had once held a low fire became, in historical memory, a dim corner. There is a temptation to compensate too strongly once the hidden material is rediscovered. A neglected subject can suddenly seem like the explanation for everything. But balance remains important. Newton's chemistry does not need to replace the familiar Newton, it needs to stand beside him. The workshop is one room within a large house of thought. Imagine moving slowly around that house. Upstairs, mathematical papers lie beside correspondence. Elsewhere, notes on scripture accumulate. A prism waits in a darkened chamber. A telescope points eastward above the garden stairs. Near the chapel, the laboratory holds its furnace glow. The same person moves among them, carrying questions that do not always respect our later divisions. The private workshop offers a lesson in historical patience. It is easy to ask for a verdict. Was Newton truly an alchemist? Did he believe in transmutation? Did chemistry shape his science? The answers require qualification. Yes, he engaged seriously and extensively with chemistry. Yes, the surviving evidence shows interest in transmutation and related traditions. Yes, scholars have good reasons to examine overlap with his natural philosophy. But no single sentence can replace the manuscripts, the decades and the uncertainties. The notebook remains closed for a moment. The room is quieter now. Outside, the garden air has cooled further. A small sound from the fire reminds us that paper and flame have always existed uneasily near one another. That uneasiness leads toward the final archival part of the story. Missing pages, later memories, a reported fire, a doubtful dog, and the long journey by which Newton's private papers return to view. Any manuscript age lives with vulnerability. A page can be stained by water, darkened by smoke, folded into the wrong packet, left behind in a move, or separated from the notes that once explained it. A candle can burn lower than expected. A fireplace can spit a spark. A loose sheet can disappear into a stack. Even without a dramatic accident, time can scatter an archive slowly. Newton's papers experienced that slower kind of scattering. He wrote an extraordinary amount. Some pages were carefully preserved. Others survived in partial or disordered forms. Drafts overlapped. Leaves became separated. Later owners and editors tried to make sense of material that had not been arranged for them. The surviving archive is rich precisely because so much remains, but it is not complete in the way a finished library catalogue might suggest. Stories of fire grew around Newton's reputation. One later account attributed the loss of a valued chemical work to a fire in the laboratory. Other retellings linked burned papers to a candle and, eventually, to a dog named Diamond. The dog story became famous because it is easy to remember. In its most polished version, a faithful animal accidentally overturns a candle, years of work are destroyed, and Newton responds with gentle resignation. The problem is that the story is uncertain. Humphrey Newton, whose recollections bring us close to the laboratory, said he knew of an accident only through what he had heard from others, and he placed it before the writing of the Principia. He also stated plainly that Newton kept neither dog nor cat in his chamber. Later reports differ in their details. The appealing image of Diamond should therefore be treated as a doubtful tradition rather than a settled fact. This does not require a harsh debunking. Legends often grow because they answer an emotional need. The Diamond story presents Newton as patient, humane, and detached from anger, even in the face of loss. It compresses the fragility of a manuscript life into one scene. It gives the listener an animal, a candle, and a memorable line. But a pleasing story can become smoother as it travels, even when evidence remains rough. The more honest image is quieter. There may have been losses. Fire was a real hazard in rooms with candles, hearths, and furnaces. Papers did disappear, yet we cannot confidently reconstruct one decisive night in which a dog destroyed a grand, completed theory. The archive leaves us with possibilities, competing accounts, and caution. That caution has its own atmosphere. Imagine ash settling after an ordinary fire is allowed to dim. A few sheets have been moved farther from the warmth. A book has been closed. The risk has passed for the night. but the vulnerability remains. Knowledge written on paper is always partly entrusted to material survival. After Newton died in 1727, the papers entered a long afterlife. They passed through family hands and inherited collections. John Conduit, married to Newton's half-niece Catherine Barton, gathered information for a life of Newton and preserved materials connected with him. Over time, the archive became associated with the Portsmouth family. The papers survived, but not always in a condition or arrangement that made Newton's private intellectual world easy to understand. In the 19th century, a major sorting effort reshaped the archive. In 1872, the 5th Earl of Portsmouth offered Newton's scientific papers to Cambridge University. A committee examined the manuscripts and attempted to classify them. The catalogue eventually appeared in 1888. The scholars involved worked with real diligence, but they also used the categories of their own period. Mathematics, chemistry, chronology, theology, history, correspondence, and personal papers were divided in ways that helped create order while also obscuring some original relationships. The problem is easier to appreciate. Imagine a manuscript stack in which mathematical notes rest beside theological reflections, chemical excerpts interrupt another sequence, and loose leaves have already shifted over time. A later editor must decide what belongs where. The act of sorting is necessary. It is also interpretive. Pages placed into separate folders can lose the evidence of their former proximity. The Newton Project has pointed out that juxtapositions appearing disorderly to 19th century scholars may have made sense to Newton. A mathematical note beside a theological draft might not have been an accident. A chemical passage near a physical observation might reveal a habit of inquiry that later disciplines split apart. Once separated, the fragments remain valuable, but the web among them becomes harder to reconstruct. The 19th century classifiers also judged many alchemical papers to be of limited value. That judgment was understandable within their context, but costly in hindsight. Newton's chemical transcriptions did not fit the purified portrait of a founder of modern science. Large portions of the private archive returned to the Portsmouth family, rather than entering the main scientific collection at Cambridge. For decades the papers waited. Their significance was not entirely unknown, but their extent had not reshaped the public picture. Newton continued to stand in the popular imagination beneath the apple tree, beside the prism, and above the equations. The laboratory remained in the background, lit only faintly by biography and scattered manuscript references. Then, in July 36, the private papers offered from the Portsmouth collection were sold at Sotheby's. The sale dispersed the archive, but it also revealed more clearly the scale of Newton's alchemical and theological work. What had seemed a peripheral interest could no longer be dismissed so easily. The manuscripts demonstrated an intellectual range far broader and stranger, in the best sense, than the familiar public portrait allowed. The economist John Maynard Keynes became one of the crucial figures in the paper's later story. Alerted to the sale too late to acquire everything he might have wanted, he began purchasing Newton manuscripts from dealers and other owners. He concentrated especially on alchemical material. Another important collector, Abraham Yehuda, pursued many of Newton's theological papers. The two collections followed different paths, but together they helped preserve parts of the archive that might otherwise have become even more difficult to trace. Keynes eventually bequeathed his Newton collection to King's College, Cambridge, when he died in 1946. His efforts brought many chemical manuscripts back into a setting where scholars could study them. Yehuda's collection later became accessible through what is now the National Library of Israel. Other papers remain in additional libraries and collections. Newton's archive is scattered geographically, but modern scholarship has made its fragments increasingly visible. There is a pleasing reversal in this history. The secret workshop was once a real place near a garden, accessible only to a few people. Modern editors face a task that is both technical and interpretive. Newton's handwriting can be dense. Pages contain deletions, additions, abbreviations, passages, symbols, and layers of revision. A diplomatic transcription tries to preserve the texture of the manuscript as closely as possible, including many of its changes. A normalized version offers a more readable form. Each serves a different purpose. One brings the reader closer to the page as an object. The other helps the reader follow the language. Digital images add another layer. The color of the paper, the crowding of the lines, the angle of an addition, and the interruption of a blot or damaged edge can all matter. A transcription tells us what the words are. An image reminds us that the words were written by a hand at a particular moment. Together they make the archive more accessible without pretending to make it simple. The scattered locations of the papers also tell part of the story. Some manuscripts are at Cambridge University Library. Many of the alchemical papers gathered by Keynes are at King's College, Cambridge. The Yehuda papers are associated with the National Library of Israel. Other items have found homes in additional collections. No single shelf contains the whole Newtonian workshop. Scholars reconstruct the larger picture by bringing records together across institutions. This reconstruction changes over time. A manuscript once held privately may enter a public collection. A difficult hand may be transcribed more accurately. A catalogue entry may identify a source Newton copied. A historian may notice that two fragments once belonged together. The archive remains alive in a scholarly sense because understanding can deepen even when the physical pages stay still. The work is necessarily collaborative. Historians of science, editors, librarians, conservators, digital specialists, Latinists, and readers of early modern handwriting each contribute something. The private labour of one scholar in a 17th-century laboratory now meets the patient labour of many people preserving and interpreting his papers. The scale has changed, but the attention remains recognisable. This is a quieter kind of return than a rediscovered treasure. No one opens a chest and finds a final philosopher's stone. Instead, thousands of small acts make Newton's private world legible again. A page photographed, a line transcribed, a source identified, a date reconsidered, a myth checked against a witness account. Historical knowledge grows through accumulation, much as the notebooks once did. Later it became a nearly invisible part of Newton's reputation, its evidence divided among packets and owners. Now digital projects allow readers around the world to view transcription, catalogue entries, and in many cases, images of the manuscript pages. The door opens again, not through fantasy, but through painstaking editorial work. The Newton Project and the Chemistry of Isaac Newton Project have made this return possible in different but related ways. The Newton Project publishes writings across Newton's scientific, mathematical, religious, administrative, and alchemical interests. The Chemistry Project focuses closely on the alchemical manuscripts, offering transcriptions, scholarly context, images, and tools for reading a difficult archive. Their work does not eliminate uncertainty. It organizes uncertainty so that better questions can be asked. A manuscript image on a modern screen is far removed from the laboratory table, yet something survives across the distance. The cramped handwriting remains. The corrections remain. The lists, excerpts, symbols, and passages remain. A page that once sat near candlelight can now be enlarged and studied in a library, classroom, or quiet room thousands of miles away. This new accessibility also changes the tone of the historical question. We no longer need to rely only on the most polished anecdotes. We can compare them with documents. We can ask whether a story rests on a contemporary witness, a later recollection, or a tradition repeated because it was memorable. We can let the diamond anecdotes soften into uncertainty, while allowing Humphrey's more modest details to grow clearer. The archive resembles the workshop itself. It contains materials that need sorting, comparison, and patience. One manuscript explains part of another. One index points toward an old book. One letter illuminates a private exchange. One catalogue entry reveals that a draft was larger than expected. The historian's labour is not identical to the chemist's, but the shared rhythm is noticeable. Observe, compare, qualify and resist the easy conclusion. A lost page can never be recovered merely by wishing for it. A separated context cannot always be restored. But enough survives to make the room visible. We know that Newton practiced chemistry seriously over many years. We know of the laboratory near the garden. We know of long spring and autumn fires. We know of crucibles, fused metals, antimony, brick furnaces, books, copied passages, the index chemicus, selected visitors, and the assistant who watched through the night. We know enough to enter carefully. We also know enough to leave some doors closed. We do not possess a complete explanation of Newton's aims. We do not know how every manuscript relates to every experiment. We cannot identify every loss. We cannot turn symbolic language into a clean modern glossary without remainder. Historical understanding grows stronger when it accepts these limits. The fire story, then, does not need a perfect ending. Perhaps papers were lost. Perhaps some losses occurred in more than one incident. Perhaps later memory gathered separate events into a single narrative. The uncertain tradition reminds us that manuscripts survive unevenly. It also reminds us why the surviving pages deserve patient care. The laboratory is quieter than it was earlier in the night. The last active work has been set aside. The glass has cooled. The crucible no longer carries the same heat. The pages have begun their long journey through time, although no one in the room can foresee the classifications, auctions, collectors, libraries and digital archives that will follow. Before we return to the garden, there is one final movement to make. Newton's life did not end in this workshop. Cambridge was a long chapter, but not the last one. The coals can dim while the story steps briefly forward toward London, the Royal Mint, and the fuller portrait left by the papers. There is a final contrast worth noticing before the garden path disappears from view. For years, Newton had considered metals in a private setting where the questions were partly hidden, the vocabulary difficult and the outcomes uncertain. In London, metal would enter his life in a more public and regulated form. Coins were not symbolic substances in an inherited text. They were objects of weight, fineness, manufacture, circulation, trust, and law. The mint demanded a different kind of exactness. The connection should not be overstated. Newton was not appointed to the Royal Mint because he had discovered a secret in the laboratory, and his mint work should not be treated as a continuation of alchemical transmutation. The institutional world of coinage had its own procedures, officers, craftsmen, records, and responsibilities. Yet there is a gentle continuity in the kind of attention the work required. Metal still mattered. Measurement still mattered. Small discrepancies still mattered. A mind accustomed to patient scrutiny found a new field in which details carried public consequences. London also changed the scale of Newton's surroundings. The quieter courts of Trinity gave way to a city of offices, workshops, streets, correspondence, and administrative demands. At Cambridge, an assistant might sit beside a furnace through the night while most of the college slept. At the Mint, Newton's decisions belonged to a larger machinery of production and oversight. The transition marks the distance between private inquiry and public duty without forcing the two into one story. The private papers travelled with the older questions, even when the daily setting changed. Notes could be retained, recopied, or revisited. Lists of chemical writers appear even on the reverse of material connected with mint business. A small archival reminder that intellectual lives do not always separate cleanly when a job changes. A page can carry traces of more than one world. By the mid-1690s, Newton's daily life changed significantly. In 1696, he became warden of the Royal Mint and moved into a more public world of administration in London. He later became master of the Mint. The work brought new responsibilities, coinage, records, standards, investigations, correspondence, and the practical demands of an institution connected to the economic life of the kingdom. It was not the same rhythm as the laboratory near the Trinity Garden. The difference can be heard in the imagined soundscape. The Cambridge workshop is quiet enough for a page turn to matter. The Mint belongs to ledgers, metalworking, offices, deliveries, and many people performing specialised tasks. A coin passes from hand to hand and must meet a public standard. Its value depends not on a private hope of transformation, but on confidence that weight and fineness can be trusted. Newton's later work unfolded within that practical system. Even so, the Gardner Laboratory remains useful as a prelude rather than a cause. It reminds us that Newton had spent years taking matter seriously at close range. He understood the discipline of watching small differences and the frustration of incomplete results. At the Mint, those habits entered a more visible life. The questions changed, the setting changed. The need for exact attention remained. We can leave the London chapter lightly sketched. It deserves its own journey on another evening. Tonight it serves only as a distant horizon, showing that the path from Trinity did not end at the garden gate. The move should not be narrated as though one Newton vanished and another appeared. The person who entered the Mint carried decades of habits with him: exactness, attention to evidence, persistence with difficult problems, and a willingness to examine details closely. Yet the Cambridge workshop belonged to a particular atmosphere and stage of life. Its garden paths, seasonal fires, college bells, and night watches receded as London responsibilities increased. Some chemical writing continued into the 1690s, and the surviving papers resist a perfectly clean boundary. Intellectual life rarely obeys the convenience of a chapter break. Still, the move to the Mint offers a natural point of reflection. The workshop that once demanded 6-week watches in spring and autumn became part of the earlier landscape of Newton's life, a place remembered by an assistant and preserved indirectly through manuscripts. Return now to the laboratory after a watch has ended. The fire has been allowed to settle. It is not extinguished in a sudden gesture. It simply grows lower. The bricks release their heat gradually. A vessel that seemed luminous near the furnace returns to a quieter surface. The candle has shortened. The book beside it is closed. Outside, the garden air feels colder after the warmth indoors. The path lies where it has always lain, leading back toward the stairs and the college rooms. Above, the telescope remains turned eastward. It may catch no particular object tonight. Its presence is enough. Near the chapel, stone walls hold the last memory of the day. What was Newton seeking in the laboratory? The safest answer is that he may have been seeking several things across many years. He was interested in transformation, in the behaviour of metals, in chemical medicine and practical processes, in the inherited language of earlier writers, in philosophical mercury, in the hoped-for work of transmutation, and in the hidden operations by which nature produced visible effects. His aims may have shifted, his confidence may have risen and fallen, some paths may have been abandoned quietly. There is no need to force one final key into the lock. A complete answer would flatten the room. Its historical value lies partly in the fact that it remains a workshop rather than a solved puzzle. Tools are present, notes accumulate, fires are maintained, questions return, knowledge advances in uneven steps and sometimes pauses before uncertainty. The familiar Newton still matters. The prism remains beautiful. The telescope remains pointed toward the heavens. The Principia remains one of the most consequential books in the history of science. The falling apple anecdote, handled carefully, remains a memorable way to think about gravity. But the fuller Newton is more human and more interesting. He read strange texts. He copied them patiently. He worked with his hands. He returned to a garden shed like a laboratory when the season changed. He left many thoughts unpublished. A life of inquiry does not have to be perfectly tidy to be meaningful. It can contain public triumphs and private uncertainties. It can move between exact mathematics and difficult symbolic prose. It can produce books that transform the world, and notebooks that remain unread for generations. It can be admired without being simplified. The workshop also offers a gentle lesson for the end of the day. Not every question has to be answered before rest. Some pages can remain open until morning. Some processes require a longer time than one night allows. Some uncertainties are not failures, they are simply the honest edges of what we know. The college is almost entirely quiet now. The last warmth remains in the brick. Ash settles into stillness. The glass vessels stand without movement. The garden path waits beneath the darker sky. From somewhere beyond the wall comes only the faintest suggestion of a world continuing on its ordinary course. We can leave Newton's notebooks where they are. We can leave the crucibles to cool. We can step through the doorway without disturbing the arrangement of the room. The small light near the garden grows softer behind us as we walk back toward the stairs. The telescope is there at the head of the descent, looking toward the east. Beyond it are the distances Newton studied so carefully. Planets, comets, the moon, and the larger patterns of the heavens. Behind us are the denser materials of the laboratory: metal, brick, ash, glass, and paper. For one last moment the two worlds rest quietly beside each other. Then the path turns. The doorway is no longer visible. Only the cooling stone of Trinity College remains. The garden settled into darkness, and the faint memory of a fire that once required someone to sit awake while the hours passed. And as the last warmth fades from the bricks and the garden settles into silence, we will leave the workshop behind for the night. Good night.
Thank you for watching Something About Sleep. Since you're clearly still awake, why don't you click on the next video and we'll see you there.